Hi everyone, welcome to Collective Intellectualities, a program where we explore issues related to education and educational theory within our world today. We are produced in conjunction with the Philosophy of Education Society of Australasia and their new digital venture, Pisa Agora, and the journal Educational Philosophy and Theory. So remember to check out the links below for more information and subscribe on whatever platform you use. So I'm Amy Soho. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Hawaii at Manoa in the Department of Educational Foundations. And this is...
Hi, I'm Alex Means. I'm graduate chair and associate professor in the Department of Educational Foundations at the University of Hawaii at Manoa.
And today we're really excited to have our guest, Dr. Georgina Stewart, an associate professor in the School of Education at Auckland University of Technology in Auckland, Aotearoa. Georgina's work examines language, knowledge, culture, and education using kaupapa Maori, feminist, and post-structuralist philosophical traditions. And thank you so much for joining us today, Georgina.
You're welcome.
Georgina, we're very excited to discuss your work today, and thank you for joining us. We wanted to begin by revisiting a short piece you wrote in 2017 in Educational Philosophy and Theory titled, "What Does Indigenous Mean for Me?" And we were wondering if you could begin by talking a little bit about your motivation for writing the piece and also some of the ideas within it.
Kia ora. Thank you for inviting me. And at the time of writing that particular piece was around a very active kind of initiative within PISA to try and diversify really the membership. And I think I was actually given that title to write to or something along those lines. So the ideas in that piece, to me, I talk about the adjective Indigenous. Firstly, I'm interested by the fact that this is a word that you find really only in the adjectival sense. So that may seem like a sort of a banal point, but it does kind of make you think about what it means. What does it mean to have an adjective that really has no noun attached? To me, it means it works because of the way that Indigenous is always placed almost in binary opposition with the West or Western. So it really comes from that kind of reified binary, Indigenous versus Western. And a couple other points that I make in that editorial concerning the word Indigenous. I refer to it as a placeholder, which is, it's a concept from basic maths, and it's intended. What I mean by that is it stands in place of an identity name, because the reality is that we all of us in the world identify ourselves using various aspects of our identity. When we identify ourselves, our ethnicity, I would never refer to myself by ethnicity as Indigenous. I would only refer to myself as Indigenous if I was I don't know, in some different kind of way, because I identify as Māori, right? And Māori are recognised as the Indigenous peoples of Aotearoa. So my identity is not Indigenous per se. And that's the sense in which I talk about the adjective Indigenous as a placeholder. It's a kind of a category group. Lots of other identity and ethnicity terms work the same way, of course. This is not something that's unique. But I think it's an important point when we start to think about what are the kinds of things that the adjective Indigenous is applied to. So we can, we often hear about Indigenous knowledge, for example. That's a very active, very important kind of worldwide discussion. And as you know, PISA and EPAT have made lots of efforts. You know, I think about the special issue by Michael Peters and Carl Micker, talking about the dilemma of Western philosophy and the sort of dead end to which Western philosophy has brought itself, and the idea that non-Western philosophies, including Indigenous philosophies, may provide some kind of way out, I suppose, if there is a dead end. It's obviously still under debate. And the other thing that I discuss in the article, a sort of a linguistic point, if you like, is the capitalization or not of Indigenous. And I noticed that particularly in the international literature from North America, where Indigenous matters are discussed frequently, there's very much a tendency to capitalize Indigenous, but decapitalize Western. And I tend to see that round the wrong way. Because Indigenous is a placeholder and not a label of identity, it makes sense to me to use a small I. However, I do find myself falling in line with the editorial policies of the publication venues where I publish. So it's not a big deal to me if it's a big I or a little I. But it's interesting when you look at the way that the word Western or West is often decapitalized. And the only times that I've seen that explained has been almost a sort of attempt to, shall we say, cast aspersions or sort of de-emphasize or, I don't really know what words to use here, but it's as if by decapitalizing the word Western, the author is trying to make it seem less important or whatever. But in my view, that's wrong too, because by decapitalizing that notion of Western, it kind of normalizes it in the text. So I myself in my own scholarly writing practice just choose to capitalize those terms, Western, when they're being used to refer to identity or knowledge, culture and those sorts of things, philosophies. And that brings me to the last thing that I think I've got to say about this little paper at the moment, which is that I think what can become confusing about the concept of Indigenous and the way that we use it and the way that we think with it is when I mean, it can be applied to knowledge. It can also be applied to language. You know, knowledge really subsumes, in my view, language, culture, philosophies, but it can also be applied to people. And that's where I think sometimes non-Indigenous people can inadvertently homogenize the people that they may be thinking about. Because if Indigenous is an umbrella category, so Indigenous knowledge is clearly not one unitary thing, right? We understand Indigenous knowledge as a sort of an umbrella term for a whole range of diverse knowledges of Indigenous peoples around the world. That's fine. But when we start lumping people into those kinds of umbrella categories, then I think we can very easily cause kind of interrelational difficulties. So in my own work, I don't refer to myself as Indigenous, I refer to myself as Māori. That for me seems like a home ground, a solid kind of base on which I can stand. And that's really all I have to say about that at the moment.
Well, it's interesting to me, this question of Indigenous as erasing the multiplicity of language, place, identity, as an umbrella term, as kind of covering over specificities. One of the things that you write about in the piece is that this reified binary between Indigenous and the West can be taken up strategically, drawing on Gayatri Spivak's notion of strategic essentialism. that it can be useful in certain moments or contexts for to create a homogenous or static indigenous identity or native identity in order to achieve specific kinds of political goals within the settler state. And I was wondering if perhaps you could talk a little bit about that in relation to some of what you've already said.
Hmm. Actually, that's not really the most useful way to think about strategic essentialism in relation to Indigenous peoples and knowledges. When I talk about Indigenous as a placeholder, I mean that it has no positive content. So it stands in the place of a positive identity, such as Māori or Hawaiian or Alaskan or any of the other multitudinous Indigenous identities that there are. So it's not so much, I don't think of that as strategic essentialism. It's an umbrella. I don't think that it doesn't necessarily erase difference, but it is important to remember that it's not unitary. It's not one homogenous thing. And I mean, just as the term Western, I'm not sure how Western people feel about being kind of interpolated as Westerners. And I dare say that most people who would come under that umbrella category would probably not, if they were asked what their ethnicity was, they would probably name their nationality or whatever. And in any case, if we look at the world, what West of what Western, what does that mean? Well, to the best of my knowledge, it comes from the days of the European Enlightenment, which kind of we locate really within the countries of Western Europe, right? But of course, long ago, the center of gravity, shifted, well, I don't know, expanded. And nowadays, the term Western has become a bit unhooked from its kind of location, hasn't it? But that's why I kind of tend to prefer, I think that it's very interesting. I think we can make an interesting comparison between global philosophy and world philosophies, and that's a point that we could talk about a little bit more. But let me come back to the question of strategic essentialism, and Indigenous people do use these strategies. In my understanding of how that works, as someone who identifies as Maori, I might at particular times for particular purposes exaggerate the difference between myself and my non-Māori collaborators or colleagues, but fully aware that Māori is sort of like a doubled identity, because ever since the invasion of Aotearoa that led to the led to the creation of New Zealand, Māori have been obliged to be bicultural, whereas non-Māori, or Pākehā, as we call them locally here, white New Zealanders, there's been a constant pressure from the colonizer for Māori to become Western, to become Pākehā. There's been an ongoing drive and motivation to call for the end of the Māori world, the Māori identity, the Māori language, and implicitly with that, really, Māori people themselves. So, it always, to me, comes down to, we can theorize and play around with and sort of philosophize about languages and knowledges and cultures, but we always need to be really mindful when we start trying to treat people that way. And this for me, this drives down to a basic principle or sensitivity of working within an educational space. We, in the philosophy of education, our work is not really complete if it stays at the kind of abstract theoretical level. As someone who has a background teaching, I'm always interested, if using that word in its full sense, in the effect of our ideas when we are teaching or interacting with people. And of course, education, as you would know, for PISA and for EPAT, education doesn't simply mean formal school systems. We think education very broadly. And I'd like to say perhaps a little bit more about that in relation to, biculturalism, but we might come on to that a little bit later, particularly with the intercultural space. Yeah. So let me see if you have any other questions.
No, I mean, actually, the last question, that's sort of related to that article is directly related to where you sort of end up there, which is in how the difficult work of negotiating difference and educate these categories and the lived differences in educational contexts. And you point out a couple of dynamics that perhaps you could comment on and discuss in relation to that. One is non-Indigenous scholars or educators wanting to draw from or extract from Indigenous knowledge to serve whatever purposes they have in mind. And then the other is the work of translating Western practices or knowledge formations into Indigenous terms. And you use the example of Western science education, translating that into Maori. And so these are two, I don't know if they're dialectical, but they're coming from two separate positions. And you talk about the tensions within those, and I wonder if you could speak to that. But also you come to the notion, you use intercultural space or third space and hybridity in your work. And I was wondering if maybe you could bridge that gap between the problems that arise from these two different strategies, either the Westerner appropriating Indigenous knowledge or the attempts to translate Western knowledge into Indigenous terms. And the third space, the intercultural space, the question of hybridity is having some potential for negotiating those. Yeah.
Yep, and going back to what I mentioned before about Māori being obliged to be bicultural since invasion or contact, if to use a more neutral term, I guess. But so really you have Māori and Pākehā in Aotearoa New Zealand have been in this kind of relationship ever since, right? Because, well, for a whole host of reasons, and let's not try and capture the history of a country in some kind of gestural way. But so Māori on the one hand were faced with having to cope and kind of live with the Pākehā, and Pākehā on their part, as I've already said, were kind of looking forward to a time, anticipating a time where there would be no relationship. So I can't think of many questions where there wouldn't, of that nature, like of that relational nature, where there wouldn't be quite a different view depending on which side of that relationship you were positioned. And one of the hardest things that I'm finding is how to help my non-Māori colleagues understand. And that's a kind of a different, we're talking here about an ontological difference, if you like, or an epistemological diversity, or multiple epistemologies, which, I don't have a philosophy background, but the little bit of reading that I've done in this kind of area, because it's a question that comes up, particularly in science education, which is where most of my background reading has been. where there seems to be, from a philosophical point of view, a real difficulty with the notion of multiple epistemologies. Now, I relate this to the kind of universalism versus relativism debate that may or may not be philosophically sound, but it seems to be connected. And I make the point that some degree of relativism is clearly necessary in order for me as a Māori to be able to claim to be Māori, to be not Pākehā. I mean, you know, and then people say, oh, but you're only part Māori, right? But the part, you know, the part doesn't sort of go away. I don't live my life. Nobody lives their life in a fraction, as a fraction, right? We are people, and you identify yourself. And it doesn't really matter how much Māori blood you have, because let's face it, the concept of race, you know, which was a pseudo-biological concept, no longer holds. That's a term that I use very, very cautiously, and I invariably use scare quotes around that term because of its logical incoherence and the fact that it was expelled from the lexicon of science at least 50 years ago, I think longer. So if race is not a coherent concept, then my ethnicity as Māori does not depend on a biological essence such as the blood. So the concept has been updated to ethnicity, which is what we're basically discussing here. I think when we talk about, you know, if we're talking about indigenous, the word indigenous and the ideas that indigenous brings with it, then we are at base talking about ethnic identity or ethnicity. And that's, I find, a concept that's not particularly well understood, but the literature on that concept talks about it coming into being, and ethnicity comes into being through contact between two different groups of people. So if I think back about the history of my country, and remembering that I'm not trying to give a complete history here, but I think, you know, prior to the arrival of British sailors in the South Pacific in Aotearoa, there was no ethnicity of Māori. Māori people identified themselves, as we still do, by our tribal kin groups. So I can call myself Māori, I'm happy enough with that. But I am always aware that it is also an umbrella label, and anytime that I'm introducing myself to another Māori person, I will introduce myself as Ngāpuhi, because that's my iwi or tribal kin group from the northern part of the country, and I'm very proud to be displaying a typical kind of photograph of that part of the country behind me as we speak. So I seem to be getting a bit away from your questions, Alex. You mentioned drawing on Indigenous knowledge, and I think one of the points that I find almost completely overlooked in the current conversations that, shall we say, science or social science or philosophy is having about Indigenous knowledge, is to recognise or, you know, own up to the fact that all of the Western disciplines construct themselves by excluding other forms of knowledge, including Indigenous knowledge. So in that sense, we see Indigenous knowledge as part of what forms, by exclusion, the Western disciplines of the Western Academy, or Global Academy, if you will. So it raises for me a kind of a logical question. Having established, say, education, if you like, or philosophy as a Western discipline by excluding knowledges, including Indigenous knowledge, why would we assume that we can easily just put pieces of Indigenous knowledge back into our discipline? It kind of doesn't really make that much sense when you think about it like that. Yeah. I think I sort of got a bit lost there. Do you want to bring me back on track?
Well, I mean, I think what you're saying is quite interesting. There are a number of scholars, I'm sure you're well aware of coloniality, that talk about the idea that something like modernity is a European invention is to erase the production of modernity through the outside, the constitutive outside of the West. That actually modernity is co-produced through a relation, the colonial relation. And I think that perhaps that's some of what you're talking about, although I don't know. I'm not, but that there. I mean, I guess I'm interested in this tension between the idea of Western knowledge being produced through an exclusion of non-Western knowledges, or is it that the Western knowledge formations were actually produced themselves through that relation to some degree, that they only they're only self-constituted through that relation themselves in terms of what they're trying to exclude. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that some of what you're saying is very interesting in that regard, in terms of them thinking about hybridity in the intercultural tensions and dynamics of negotiating the idea of multiple epistemologies. I mean, I still think that often when that gets gestured toward, there's an assumption of a Western norm, and then there are these alternative epistemologies, like you said, that then get sort of in like, I don't know, brought into it. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I'm asking a question, but these are just some of the ideas that are sort of circulating in my mind when I'm listening to what you're saying. Some of those complexities of historical production of knowledge systems that may seem distinct, but actually have been produced at least since, say, contact, through a co-production produced through the colonial relation itself. And I don't know what you would say about that, and I don't know how that is lived or experienced in a context like a school, and conflicts over curriculum and representation, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Well, let me say a few words about that and about modernity, and I think, yes, I think you're right about colonialism being implicit within modernity, but perhaps even more so is science, actually, and because many of the criteria of science are also, you know, what we think of as the essence of modernity. And I think that colonialism was sort of like the empirical, I suppose, laboratory. Really, it's like using the world as a laboratory, and you know, and it's definitely on record that the West, or the Western European voyages of discovery, certainly resourced and supported the rise of science in Western Europe. There's no, like, we can't get outside of epistemology, can we? We can't sit somewhere, we can't do the God trick and sort of examine different ways of thinking or of being human. But, you know, one thing that I find, another thing that I find is often overlooked is the notion that curriculum, the actual concept of curriculum, is itself a product of the technicist, modernist way of thinking. So just as, I mean, you can't separate colonialism from the rise of science, but those big historical processes also happened at the same time as the disciplines of the academy were being laid down, right? Because, I mean, science and maths and philosophy are ancient, and literature, but they certainly came into their current form in that same period of centuries during the age of the rise of science and the rise of Western colonization of the rest of the world, if you will. So I guess that comes back to the idea of the hyphen or the hybridity, because if you take seriously these ideas or this kind of set of ideas that we've just been mapping about how Indigenous knowledge has been excluded, and that calls into question whether we can just poke it back in, then that is for me, if you take the difficulty of that seriously, then I think that helps you to see that there will always be a kind of a tension or a gap or some kind of rubbing point, shall we say, when between cultures in their full extent. So that's, you know, that notion of the hyphen, can I say that you know, that's a theoretical concept, and it was first used in the context of the Maori Pākehā relationship by my good friend Alison Jones, who is a Pākehā scholar, has just released her biography called Being Pākehā, This Unsettled Life. I might have that just not quite right, but it's something like that, where she traces her own personal history of encountering Māori as a Pākehā New Zealander and coming into relationship with Māori. Now, I should say that white New Zealanders who choose to consider themselves or identify themselves as Pākehā are almost sort of, by that very naming, placing themselves in relationship with Māori, if that makes sense. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and I want to be clear too. The points I'm making about the colonial relation as constitutive of modernity is not simultaneously to erase the asymmetries of like violence and power that are embedded within, you know, the Western scientific enterprise as it, you know, created these racist taxonomies of places and peoples in the world, and on and on and on. But in terms of what you're saying about this particular book and this particular story of coming into relation, I mean, that relation was always there, but there must have been some sort of an educational process or journey for this person to be able to begin to deconstruct the relationship itself, and how that person how that person's identity, white identity, has been produced through that relation historically, you know. So all that is very, very interesting. And so I think maybe this is a good moment to transition just a little bit to a couple of other questions that I think take up that intercultural dynamic and that hyphen. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Amy here.
Yeah, no, well, because also I think when you're, and coming back to Georgina with what you were talking about earlier with just the linguistics and the purposeful use of capitalizing Western, and I think, and how there's multiple ontologies, multiple epistemologies. And what I was thinking, especially with hyphens, because just as you talk about with hyphen, that is already presupposing that there is a relationship, that it takes the relationality and it doesn't, you know, it exposes it, whereas, you know, possibly before or in other ways with a very specific, say, Western notion is, and I think you say it's a very linear way of thinking, very like unidirectional. It's not bidirectional, multi-directional. And with that, I was thinking through, and for both this, with the from both sides of the Indigenous settler hyphen and Aotearoa New Zealand, there's also that rejection of the linear narrative of thought and being and thinking, and also space, time, and perspectives, right? Or like locational spaces. And so, and we talked about this before, but how do you see this development in, you term it the liminal intercultural spaces, which I think is such a great term to speak to, not just the ambiguity, but just this almost restlessness, or that there's the possibility of other ways, not just this one way of thinking.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely do consider that Māori and Pākehā have been in a relationship since contact. That's just that it changes from both sides, and in fact, I mean, one of the ideas that people seem to respond to really well, really positively, is when I call that relationship a love affair, just as much as anything else. And I use that term deliberately to acknowledge the heavy history of intermarriage. So our country is not a country that has ever gone through a kind of apartheid aspect. It's been more like a subsuming, I suppose, rather than a keeping apart. Sorry, I sort of seem to keep going off on tangents in my head. There's so much we could talk about here.
That's quite all right.
Well, we love tangents.
I was, the theoretical term hyphen, was actually picked up from a feminist scholar by the name of Michelle Fine. I think that's her surname. I mean, I think that's how you say her surname. That's how it looks to me anyway. So, we could have the same conversation between different people of different kinds, Māori and Pākehā, women and men, similar thing. But one of the things, I mean, there's been much more attention paid to the sort of macro violence of colonization, I think probably in every colonized country, particularly in this case in New Zealand, from what I know of. Most Māori families have a history where there was some kind of theft or cheating out of their economic land bases and so forth. Yes. There's been less attention, and this is where I'm really interested, and I suppose where my work centres. There's been less attention paid to the philosophical violence of colonisation, insofar as Māori thought, Māori language, and Māori ideas about everything were taken as being vastly inferior to those of English or European derivation. Now, this causes problems, and again, this is something that I've only recently been thinking about, and it doesn't seem to me to be widely acknowledged or known. But one of the ways in which that was done was that because Western knowledge and culture and so forth and people and everything was held to be so vastly superior to those of Māori, the assumption inherently was made that there could exist no Māori concepts that did not also exist in the English Western cultural language. So what this has meant is over the years, over the generations, is that Māori philosophies have been completely taken up, appropriated and distorted and brought into the public record. And I mean, it is the case. I see not only science knowledge, Western culture, and even the English language all have this quality of being able to take resources from other cultural groups and kind of use what they want or what makes sense within, reframe, right? And use, like for science, it's often said, we often hear it said that Indigenous knowledge has a lot to offer science, right? You guys have heard that? Are you familiar with that kind of idea?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. But the trouble with that is that there's a fine line. Well, I think when people say that, many times, often they're thinking about how, for example, Māori knowledge of particular native plant species, herbal medicine properties, and those have been picked up and have been commercialized and so on and so forth. So is that what we mean when we say that Indigenous knowledge has a lot to offer science? Because that's really a kind of a colonization, isn't it? I think the other way that kind of idea is promulgated is what I sort of referred to before, as this idea that there is a wisdom within Indigenous knowledge that has been lost from science or Western knowledges. But with that kind of 200 years of hierarchical kind of denigration and really almost destruction of any possibility that Māori could have cognitive resources that are not available in the European or English equivalents, it becomes quite hard to find that. And the other thing that happens, of course, is that we see over and over again. I mean, I read about these Mauna Kea, right? In your own, in the country that you're based in, has such significance to the natives, but is seen simply as convenient site to, from which to conduct astronomy. I mean, I don't know the details, so I probably shouldn't even mention it. That goes back to what I sort of referred to before. Although I'm Indigenous, I can really only speak from my own identity as Māori, right? But I mean, very similar things happen here. Sacred sites, etc., put under threat. Even going to court, because our society, New Zealand society, seems to have a real tendency to want to be seen to be giving due consideration to Māori causes. But when you put really Indigenous knowledge up against science, that's where you get the kind of dissonance. And in the, I mean, I'm referring to a court case over a motorway, a new motorway being built, where the local people, their concern was that it was disturbing the place of residence of their spiritual guardian, which we would call a taniwha. You put that kind of knowledge claim in the court system and it will always be trumped by Western scientific, rational, and all the rest of it, modernist frameworks. So it becomes very difficult, and so that claim sits there. Indigenous knowledge has so much to offer science, but I never see it kind of go beyond that. And indeed, I mean, in more recent work that I've published in not in EPAT, but in the Journal of the Royal Society of New Zealand, which is our top sort of science, that's our top science journal in this country. And there is beginning to be the same debate about science and Indigenous knowledge, or particularly in this case, Māori knowledge, in the pages of that journal. And I was motivated or inspired to respond to a short article that had been written some years ago by a Māori scientist who laid down an argument for thinking, or for arguing that Māori knowledge is science. And so he used various arguments to make this case. But to me, that misses the point that the value of Indigenous knowledge, not just for science, but also for Indigenous people, its value is actually in its difference. The fact that it's different is what Māori knowledge sort of, and Māori philosophy underpins Māori identity. So I see Māori philosophy or Māori philosophical ideas as an important plank of my identity as Māori.
Sorry, Amy, go ahead.
No, I mean, from hearing you say that too, that phrase, what does, like Indigenous knowledge, or what does Maori knowledge have to offer science? Even within that phrase, it just, to me, I feel that's continuing like an extraction, like an over extraction of continued colonization and violence, where it's, instead of it's working within the Western science framework. And I think how you speak to the values, and it's different, not trying to put it again into compartmentalizing and just, separate with that. I mean, I think that's a really important part. And also I think it makes me think of, I know we talked about strategic essentialism, but I know in one of your other recent article from, I think it was this summer, a typology of Pākehā, whiteness in education, and it talks too, right, about the way how Western essentializing, I think, of identity from, who can work within that Western framework, and how I'm making a very awkward transition to the article, but because I think I see all of these just kind of interrelated, right, with how we're talking about science, how we're talking about philosophy, but just maybe thinking more about how you make the 5 different types with that. And I think also how identifying these types with that actually resists this intentional ignorance, right, about identity and being and relating, but also seeing the cultural commodification that happens with essentializing identity, and how you said like subsuming identity, even within, right, the term of unfortunately how you said with indigenous, because it's already an umbrella term, that how does that even speak to just the multitude of difference? And I wonder if you would want to talk about the different, the 5 different types, and how you see that as resisting, these tendencies to essentialize identity.
Yes. I think the important thing for me about what's happening now in education in this country is this appearance of being supportive to Māori. The typology came about really because, there was that earlier paper where it identified white saviors versus white allies as a sort of a binary categorization, which was important. And I mean, the article that I kind of was inspired by, both white savior and white ally are terms for white people who are trying to work in some way positively with and for, or whatever, non-white people, and shall we say working against. But the problem is that white people often don't turn around and look at themselves. They are often focused on the indigenous person, and that for me is problematic. I think the typology paper was came into being when I recognized that I was in a relationship with the category, or with somebody who I came to see as a cultural vampire, meaning that just in the actual interaction that we had, I just came to feel that I wasn't so much being seen as a person in my own right, but as a very interesting kind of exotic source or resource that the other person could use to find out about, in this case, why there is such a gap between the achievement of different ethnic groups. So that the vampire idea was the person who almost wants to take over the indigenous identity. And then I sort of extended that, because I thought, well, all 3 positions on the surface are friendly, shall we say, towards the indigenous or towards the non-white person. But we also have these other positions that are quite clearly not friendly. So I included the exterminator, which is very common in New Zealand and follows that kind of ideology that started way back, of offering to Māori. The bargain that the British colonisers offered Māori was, we won't exterminate you, but we expect you to become like us. And Gayatri Spivak talks about that too. She talks about the command to turn to the West, turn towards the West, I think is the word she uses. But then there's that second part to that message, but you will never be quite the same as us, and this is written about in the early colonial milieu, that Māori were under a great deal of pressure to adopt European ways, clothing, diet, and all the rest of it, but at the same time had this kind of double whammy of, but you'll never be quite the same as us, you know. So it's so the exterminator position, you know, and in that paper I give some examples that have taken place where some, you know, very highly ranked academics and business leaders promulgate this idea that there are no real Māori left, right? So that comes back to the point I made before about the difference between race and ethnicity. If we don't believe that the concept of race has actual coherent meaning, then whose business is it how much blood I've got? And I've actually come up with a kind of a definition for myself of, if we think about ethnicity as the way to kind of, as the how to think about this, then that's really about who you see yourself to be. And it seems to me, such as in my father's case, that if all four of your grandparents identified themselves as Māori, then all of your influences, all of your major influences growing up and coming to a sense of identity would have been Māori, and therefore that person, in terms of ethnicity, can rightly claim to be full Māori. Because we don't care about blood anymore, right? Because it's not about a pseudo-biological kind of obsession with blood or any other kind of thing. You know, and I mean, all my life in this country, Māori have been considered to be intelligent if they take after their non-Māori side. You know, and as a little girl who was brown and very bright, because I started reading very, very early, because my mother and her mother were teachers and they gave me generous access to books, and I had an excellent education, you know, in our primary schools here, in our state school system, which worked really well at the time. You know, it's struggling now under decades and decades of neoliberal policy and so forth. What was I talking about? Books. Yeah, so I was this bright little brown girl and constantly seen as this kind of exception, right? So I guess those early experiences have led me to think quite deeply about what it means to be Māori today, you know, and what really is it about at bottom, and really what is it about updating the outdated idea of race to ethnicity. You know, what effect does that have? You know, and I mean, my own home, you know, both my parents had both European and Māori blood, but my father, even though he wasn't full blood, he had one non-Māori ancestor where my surname came from. But all of his adult influences were Māori, so ethnically you could say he was full Māori, whereas my mother had one Māori ancestress way back, and that heritage was suppressed in her family. So by the time she came along, she was interested in it, and she set out to explore it, and that was part of the attraction. So although they were both part Māori, my mother was seen as Pākehā in relation to him. In relation to my father. So I kind of grew up in this household full of these tensions, you know, not only between different cultures and backgrounds, but also, of course, the usual ones of patriarchy and all the rest of it, you know? Yeah.
And then also like the cultural perceptions and expectations and like that are placed onto that. You know, hearing you talk about like how perceived, but I'm saying like, well, this is my identity, you know, whereas the voice feels like, well, this is my identity, this is how I consider myself. That's why I thought with that article though, having it expanded out to the 5 different types, and because it really relates to just complicating what is perceived often, right, is just placing one thing into another with, say, like culture. I think some of the examples you bring, if you're doing you know, the different bringing in parts of a culture, but does it actually recognize the full context and the full extent, and otherwise it's just a very simplistic or shallow way that doesn't actually engage with it, I guess. With like what you say, like you're bringing in protocol, right? I think some of your examples, and it gets placed into the school, but then that becomes it dead ends there, right?
Yeah, it's so distorted and shallow. Yes, and we have, so in our education here in New Zealand today, we have a situation where, you know, I mean, culturally responsive pedagogy is huge here, right? But there's an illogic, because that's been taken to mean non-Māori teachers are now being forced to teach Māori language and culture. And of course, I believe that there should be a place for Māori language and culture in every classroom in this country. But to think that the reason behind it, the reason that's always behind any Māori education policy, is to close the gap. That's all the policy wants to do, is to equalise achievement rates. But I'm blessed if I can understand how teaching Māori language and culture is going to get Māori students achieving in the normal curriculum, which is English medium. You know, English language schools are by definition, you know, assessing students against their achievement in English language subjects. So I think there's a kind of a mixed, you know, it's like we're crossing our wires really quite severely. You know, another thing because I do experience difficulties in my professional life and within my school here, you know, I talk about the doubled identity, and I think I'm a good example of this, because I have always identified as Māori, but I also happen to be a reasonably senior academic, and I wasn't employed here in a Māori role. And I supervise you know, plenty of doctoral students whose topic and research has got nothing to do centrally with Māori. But I'm often sort of placed in that box so that people who maybe, you know, newly appointed colleagues or whatever will tend to assume that my role is to do those cultural things. You know, I've received requests to sort of like put a Māori bit at the beginning of my letter, please. I'm like, no, why should I? So those sorts of things happen. But one of the things, you know, because I've been trying to kind of lead a discussion about culturally responsive pedagogy, right? And the trouble with culturally responsive, my idea of the trouble with culturally responsive pedagogy is that it tends to put the focus on the student who is other. So we've been teaching a paper called that in our ITE program, where we teach a little bit about how do you teach Māori students successfully? How do you teach Pacific students successfully? How do you teach immigrant students, or, you know, non-Pacific immigrant students? So, you know, like as if there's a kind of a trick or a special way, or that these students have kind of special needs. Whereas really everything that you read in the literature about culturally responsive pedagogy, the attention should be on the teacher. The attention should be on the white culture. It's culturally responsive. All the definitions are that it means respecting and acknowledging the culture of the students that you're teaching. But isn't that just normal part of good teaching? So if we need to talk about it, it's, for me, a sign that it's not, what we're doing normally is not culturally responsive. So in my, you know, from that point of view, we should be focusing not so much on the students' culture, but on the lack of acknowledgement on the part of the school system of the history of racism that underpins our education system. And you in your introduction, your very nice introduction to me at the beginning, you mentioned kaupapa Māori, right? And I don't know if you know much about that, but we could call it a critical Māori way of thinking about teaching and learning and research and knowledge and education and all the rest of it. In fact, one way that I like to define kaupapa Māori is it's like the opposite of Eurocentric. It's Māori-centric. So it's not Māori only, and people often mistake it for this. They think that kaupapa Māori means somehow trying to live as if the Pākehā world had never arrived here and live in the world of our ancestors, pre-European, which is clearly pretty impossible. So rather than thinking of it as Māori only, for me it makes sense to think of it as Māori-centered or Māori-centric. So looking both, for me, if I'm talking about myself, it would be looking at both the Māori world and the Pākehā world from a Māori point of view. And I mean, that sort of sounds simple, but I find it incredibly difficult. And I'm having a current point of sort of teaching point, if you will, in my school with my colleagues here, where I've said to them, kaupapa Māori is the opposite of culturally responsive pedagogy. And that, for many of my colleagues, is a very difficult idea to understand. But that for me tells me that it's a worthwhile lesson, to try and help them to know more about what we're doing. And the last point I'd like to make, because we're talking, I've been talking about education a lot, is I think what I'm doing here is, like you said, Amy, making it complicated, because it's not simple. It's not a black and white. It's not a binary either or kind of a thing. Being Māori today is like a continuum. And I would say probably today in most colonized countries, to be Indigenous means you can take up a range of positions. But the whole point for me of the hyphen and wanting to advocate for biculturalism is that I think it's an extremely educative process. Educative in that bigger sense. And I would go so far as to say that I think that the relatively bilateral, it's not, of course there's a big hierarchy, but in New Zealand, racism is at a kind of a subtle level. Māori were never exterminated, and so on and so forth. So to struggle with the relationship, I would go so far as saying that has been part of what we see in New Zealand in its place in the world today. We see a country, yes, we're small, we're sea-bounded, we've got lots of advantages over a lot of other countries that are grappling with the pandemic. But more than that, we have the ability to act together for the good of the country. And I would go so far as to hypothesize or speculate that this ongoing relationship and this ongoing struggle to understand the bicultural relationship is part of what has made New Zealand a strong country today.
Well, that is a wonderful note to sort of wrap up our conversation, I think. And we just want to thank you again for talking with us today. I feel like I learned a lot. So
yeah, well, I want to say one more little thing, because
sure.
we did talk about my book.
Yes.
My book is the first book. I can't find any other book that's been published yet with the term Maori philosophy in the title. And the book came about as part of a series of textbooks on world philosophies. And that's a series that's being published by Bloomsbury Books in London. And the editor is someone that I was fortunate enough to get to know, Monica Kurloskar-Steinbach. And so we've become friends and we stay in contact even though she lives in Germany and it's a long way away and so forth. But the book, the last point I guess I'd like to make is that the book is my attempt to exercise my philosophical rights to be Māori, to think Māori, and to think with Māori cognitive resources.
Well, we'll definitely put a link into the book, and then perhaps at a later date we can bring you back and have another discussion. Amy and I will have a chance to read it, and we'll have another discussion.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was really a delight to talk with you.
Okay.